I'm Yonit Levy of Channel 12 in Tel Aviv.
And I'm Jonathan Friedland of The Guardian in London.
And we are Unholy, two Jews on the news from Keshet Podcasts. How are you doing, Jonathan?
You know, I should say I'm all right. We're going to be getting into lots of sort of heavy stuff. But the truth is, my mind is completely in the 16th century and maybe early 17th century because I'm just immersed in planet Tudor at the moment. Tudor history is all I can really think about, morning, noon and night.
Well, I'm going to confess before we kind of dive into this that I'm a Plantagenet gal myself.
You're big in this period.
More the Henry V, you know, I call him Prince Hal. He's more, that's my guy. But, you know, I'm fine to dive into the Tudors with you if you want. It's always funny, you're always surprised that non-Britons are obsessed with the Tudors. It's very funny.
I am. I can't believe it. No, I'm in that mode I have an excuse because my youngest son is doing A-level history. Mm-hmm. He has his big exams right now, in the summer exams. And the very first one is Tudor history. And so, you know, it becomes a family project testing him using those little index cards. So if you want to talk for an hour about Henry VII, if we want to hear about the Earl of Throckmorton, I'm good on that.
We can have him on, actually. You don't do officials, so I don't know if we could do that.
No, so we don't do that. But no, I could talk about any of that, but that has been where my head has been. And in fact, I think it's true to say that as you and I speak now, he is mid-exam.
Oh, wow.
And so, you know,
so we're sending him the good vibes. The good vibes.
Yeah,
but it's so sweet of you to help with all the preparation. I don't know if every parent does that. It's really lovely, I think.
You know, well, he's been doing all the studying. That's all him. This is just the sort of testing process, pacing up and down, you know, firing questions. This is that process. Let's hope it.
So who's your favorite tutor?
Well, partly because I always like somebody who's, you know, I always like people who go for the early albums, you know, early Beatles, sort of obscure references. So I am quite into Henry VII. I think Henry VII is interesting. All the airtime goes on Henry VIII and Elizabeth I. I find Henry VII interesting. Role of a founder.
Wasn't supposed to be the king. All kinds of stuff about him.
Yeah, this is you on your strongest suit again.
We can do it. Let's forget the Jewish podcast. Let's just do the history podcast.
Tudor podcast would be big. That would be big. Somebody ought to do that.
Could we do the Tudor Jewish podcast? Could you think of that for a minute?
That is niche. Anyway, we have bigger stuff to talk about than the Tudors because lots has been going on in the world. You know, last time you and I spoke, there was a very obvious Jewish dimension to this horrible mass shooting in Buffalo, New York, because the alleged killer, the suspect, had posted online a so-called manifesto, a hate-filled screed, 29 pages of which were all about the Jews and Jews being behind replacement theory. As it stands, this absolutely hideous school shooting in Uvalde, Texas, where 19 school children and 2 adults, their teachers, were shot dead in a massacre, a mass shooting, doesn't have an obvious, you know, similarly obvious motivation or therefore, you know, anti-Semitic purpose behind it. Nevertheless, I think it's something we should talk about. Partly just because, you know, there's a question in there which I'm very interested to hear from you about what Israel does with guns and gun control. Because from my point of view, I've just been watching this thing. And, as you know, I was a correspondent in America for several years and covered, you know, a fair share of these horrible events. And there's just something so kind of ritual about them where as soon as they've happened, Republicans and Democrats broadly go into their corners, red corner and the blue corner, and Republicans will say, don't politicize a tragedy. You know, you can't say anything. It's just the best way to stop a bad guy with a gun is a good guy with a gun, and all these lines. And Democrats say, what about making it as hard to buy a gun as it is to buy a bottle of beer? Should we do that, maybe? And so that, you know, an 18-year-old who cannot buy alcohol cannot buy a gun because at the moment they can. And suddenly they are accused of, you know, dancing on the graves of the victims or whatever. It's just, it sickens me, to be truthful. But it also, I think, if I was living in America still, I think it would fill me with such despair because Majorities want there to be change, and yet nothing happens. And it was the same story after Sandy Hook, and it's going to be the same story now. So I'm interested to know if other places, I know how Britain does it, where there are no handguns. Basically, they were made illegal after a terrible school shooting in the 1990s. But what the picture is in Israel.
It's interesting, Jonathan. I was thinking about the fact that last week, it's coincidence completely. There was a drill on a massive scale in Israel, and all over the country, children practiced walking down to a bomb shelter, right, in case a rocket is launched from Hezbollah or in Lebanon or from Hamas in Gaza. And you think to yourself, this is quite a dangerous place to raise children. But we know what the reality is, and we know that we have external threats and that there are malignant actors all around. But to think that you have to have a drill in which children are facing a live shooter, right? And you have these images that are just heartbreaking of a parent telling his little daughter, this backpack can change into a bulletproof vest for you. I mean, it's terrible. And as you said, we both spent, I think, this similar amount of time in the United States, and you look at it and you kind of find yourself dumbfounded. And you asked about Israel. I think Israel is a really interesting case because Israel is both, first of all, well-armed, which we should say, but also very, very well regulated. And this is the point, right? So the state essentially has a very, very strict regulations. Who can have weapons, how they have to have a note from the doctor that they are healthy mentally and physically. They have to go through tests. You can only have in your possession one firearm and 50 bullets, and that is it. And there's there's specific people who can have it or not. You have to get a license. 40% of requests are denied. So you see that there is a whole sort of very, very regulated firearms situation here. And it also, I think the underlining thing to say about it, obviously, is that in Israel, it's not the issue of I have a firearm because I'm distrustful of my neighbor, I distrust my neighbor, I distrust the state, and I want to protect my family. It's being the first or another line of defense when terror comes in. So that's a whole different sort of, I think, pulse of a nation with your relation to firearms in general.
That particular point is interesting because it means it's about collective protection rather than individual protection. Now, if you ask me, I think that's what the Second Amendment of the United States Constitution was actually about, a well-regulated militia. Not just every individual can take a kind of weapon of war, these assault rifles, just for themselves. So I think that's a really fascinating difference, that it's part, in a way, almost understood that if an Israeli has a gun, it's as part of some collective national self-defense, if it's needed. But that point, I mean, even just that one you said, about 40% of applicants are denied. I mean, that is huge. Whereas the whole boast that Americans make is that you can just walk in and buy one. No background checks required, no questions asked. Go to a gun show. You may not even have to show ID. You can pay in cash. You walk out with a military-grade weapon. Yeah. It is really shocking. The reason why I was particularly keen for you to talk about Israel is that I think Americans, and particularly the American right, if somebody like me, and I did this when I was there in the United States, would mention the British experience of this particular event in Dunblane, Scotland, where children were killed in a similar style. I mean, really, it's not that different from what happened in Texas or Sandy Hook. Mm-hmm. And immediately the entire political community, I mean, both sides, all sides, closed ranks and just said, we're banning handguns. You just can't really get them unless you are in the sort of criminal underworld and, you can't get them. And there hasn't been a school shooting ever since. And that's more than a quarter of a century ago. You would say that to Americans. They go, yeah, okay, Europe, it's different there. Or,
by the way, same story in Australia, I think, right? Same thing.
Well, the same story. You say to them Australia, New Zealand, Sweden, they'll always say, yeah, it's different there. It's easy. It's, you don't know what threats are like. You don't live in this kind of culture. We've talked about this on this podcast, this sort of Mars-Venus distinction. Americans are from Mars, Europeans are from Venus. Well, guess who else is from Mars? Israelis, right? There's something in common there. Yep. I'm talking about from the perspective of the American right.
Yes.
They felt during the war on terror, they were there, and so was Israel. Israel knows what it's like to deal with terror. Mm-hmm. Israel knows what it's like to be in a tough neighborhood. Mm-hmm. Israel knows what it's like because every citizen is also a soldier. If Israel and Israelis say to Americans, we're like you in all these respects, but we're really not like you when it comes to guns. We regulate them. We make sure people can't have them. We reject 40% of applicants. I wonder if a lot of those very gung-ho, pro-Israel, right-wing Republicans might listen to Israelis saying that in a way they won't listen to me or a Belgian or a Swede talking about guns.
Yeah, I mean, you should just go on the site, right, to get a license. I did this morning, not because I wanted to get a license. I was preparing for our conversation. There are so many restrictions and regulations. We should just translate that from Hebrew into English because you have to be 18. It's a law from 1949, by the way. You have to be 18. You have to submit the results of your health test. You have to have a training period. You have to have a reason. You have to have the police authorizing it. It's a very, very long list, as it should be, by the way, until you can go through this process. As you say. Yeah. And again, I think we're a good example, quote unquote, because we do have a lot of firearms. You walk around in Israel, there are people with weapons, but you don't have this situation in which someone can actually step into a school and shoot children. It doesn't happen. But I do want to make this point because we are talking about Israel a lot. There is a problem and it's a growing concern. And it's plaguing specifically the Arab community in Israel. And that's the spread of organized crime. And you see a very, very large number of illegal firearms and weapons, ammunition, semi-automatic guns, all coming either smuggled from Lebanon and Jordan or manufactured in the Palestinian territories or actually stolen from the military. And the estimation is there are tens of thousands of these. And the victims of those weapons and those cars are innocent civilians in the Arab society. Only in 2021, 126 Arab Israelis were killed. The number doubling itself in recent years. And this is obviously a problem when you see, by the way, it's trickling down in some cases into terror because you see the two Arab Israelis who did the terror attack in Hadera a few weeks ago. They had semi-automatic weapons because of this issue. But again, this is specifically, it should be dealt with and the Arab community is dealing with it and so is the police. But that is a specific case in Israel that should be dealt with and should be mentioned.
No, absolutely. And look, other countries around the world too are not sort of gun free, and it is a problem. But usually it's a problem in the way you've defined it, which is it could be about a sector or as a criminal problem, rather than it being a case that in the United States there are 120 guns for every 100 people. As I say, I think America is an outlier. Mm-hmm. There's this Onion headline, which they repurpose every time there's one of these school shootings, they do it again, which is, why does this keep happening? Asks country, which is the only place where this keeps happening.
It's one of the tragic Onion headlines, not the funny ones.
Yes, I mean, it's one of those powerful ones. And they're the only place where this happens. It's true. They are such a massive outlier statistically on these kinds of gun deaths. No, the other thought that came into my mind, we mentioned him last week. I think he was our mention of the week last week. The British comedian Sacha Baron Cohen, he created this character, Colonel Eran Morad, the fictional Israeli colonel who got himself in front of a whole lot of Republican politicians, Dick Cheney and others, saying what actually was the reverse of the truth, that we in Israel train our kindergartners, 2 and 3-year-olds, to use assault weapons. Why don't you do this in America? And instead of saying, that is hideous, get out of my office, they were like, oh, okay, maybe, sounds a good idea. And they even agreed to pose for what they thought was a promo for this campaign to get toddlers to wield high-velocity weapons. The point he was bringing out there was brilliant, was that when it comes to security, there's a kind of deference by a certain stripe of American conservative. They defer to Israel. They think you're the most militarized society in the world, surely. Whatever you say about guns, we'll listen to. And therefore, they were prepared to do something ridiculous and appalling. I'm sort of saying, let's have a real-life Colonel Eran Morad go to these politicians and say, yeah, I'm from this modern-day Sparta that you keep loving because it's so on the front line in the war against terrorism and so on. Listen to how we handle guns. I just think there may be something there that Israel has. We've talked before when Israel had a particular expertise to offer the world about coronavirus. Obviously, we'll talk about in future weeks about high tech and everything else. I wonder if Israel has a USP in particularly talking to the very group of people who will not take it from anyone else. And I'm thinking of those American conservatives in places like Texas, a mission from Israel to tell them about guns.
Let's say it's still...
call it pro-life. Why not? Go crazy. Call it pro-life.
You even have the slogan. It's still simpler in this country, in Israel, to buy baby formula than it is to get a gun, not the other way around. So...
You see, that's the slogan right there. I think it's we've done some good. I feel between us there. I think that could be something.
It's rare, but I think we did. I think we did manage it.
Yeah, I mean, anyway, beyond awful. So that's making big news around the world. But where we ended, or we left listeners on a bit of a cliffhanger last week with what's going on inside Israel itself.
Well, I can't not think. Remember that scene in History of the World, Mel Brooks's fantastic film, in which it's like the eve of the French Revolution and it's a destitute market, and they go through the camera goes through the stalls, and there's this vendor yelling, rotten apples, and then the other one is yelling, I can sell rats, I'm selling rats, and the final vendor is yelling, nothing, I have nothing to sell. So that is a little bit the state, maybe it's cruel, but that's a little bit the state of the Israeli coalition at this point. Look, we're stuck in a twilight zone when it's clear that the coalition situation is not going to improve in any way. But the opposition has not yet succeeded to find the 61st vote to dissolve Parliament. Where we stopped last week, and it was this sort of drama that unfolded as we started our recording, was that the lawmaker from the left, from the Meretz party, Ghaidari Nawi Zobi, said she was quitting the coalition, potentially giving the opposition its vote to dissolve Parliament, only to be placated by Yair Lapid and budgets for the Arab community. And she took a step back from that. But look, Jonathan, I mean, we're in a situation, again, where you just need one coalition member to leave. Naftali Bennett has now lost his two most trusted advisors. One of them, we talked about her last week, because Shimlit Meir was trying to make him more of a central political figure. The other is Tal Gantzvi from the right, who is, his ally for 10 years and left this week. At this point, the coalition is quite helpless. It can't pass or submit any bill. It had a very popular bill about scholarships for soldiers that the United Arab List wouldn't vote for, and then they needed the Likud to not vote against it just so it would pass. It's an indication of just how dire things are. How long this will last? It can take weeks, but it's not going to last a lot more than that.
What decision did the Likud take on that bill?
It decided not to vote against. This was after recordings came out of a member of Knesset from the Likud, Miri Regev, saying we have to topple every one of the coalition's laws, even if they're helping soldiers, even if they're helping women who were victims of sexual assault, even if, all of that. And they're helping the handicapped. We still need to topple every one of those laws just to topple this government. The recordings came out on our network, and that made them a bit uncomfortable. And so they had to not be the obstacle for this specific bill, but still, I mean, it is indicative of how dire the situation is for the coalition.
Yeah, and so you measure its lifespan in weeks.
I was going to say if I have to bet all the money in my pockets, but why should I do that? Let's bet all the money in your pockets that it's
in Tudor coin, though.
Exactly.
It may not be worth that much, but
so
go on.
No
yes,
beheadings
what would you say?
If anyone gets it wrong, just saying. I would say weeks, yes.
Gosh, okay, so we'll be braced for that. I think that is partly because American politics is a bit in my head, given what we talked about before. But that notion, the leaked recordings saying we'll have to vote against anything, it reminds me a little of that quote attributed to Mitch McConnell in the first term of Barack Obama. What is your objective for the new congressional term? He was asked, and he said, to make Barack Obama a one-term president, meaning we will deny him anything that even looks like a legislative achievement because we want to make him so unpopular. In other words, not we're going to do what the country needs, but only what makes him look bad. That kind of sounds like that's some of the same political thinking there, although, brilliant to have made it public and therefore perhaps to have sort of scuppered that strategy.
אם אשכחך ירושלים, תשכח ימיני, כי דיברת לשוני לחיכי, אם לא אזכרכי, אם לא אעלה את ירושלים, על ראש שמחתי.
Amen.
This, my friend, is a little piece of television history, I think. This week, reality television, one of the most popular programs in Israel. The program Married at First Sight had, for the first time, a gay couple getting married, Guy and Matan. I should also point out, I'm being a very patriotic Israeli here, but that the American version of Married at First Sight, now in its 14th season, never had a gay couple getting married. So this is very exciting. I see you're very excited. You love reality television, so I can see that you're very...
Well, as you can imagine, I'm a devoted viewer of Marriage at First Sight. Not completely. I have seen it a bit. I saw one episode of the Australian edition. I have to say, it did fill me slightly with existential despair for the future of the human race. So I'm not a natural viewer for this show, but I do know a progressive step forward when I hear or see one. And so this is interesting to me for the reasons you've just said. I'm guessing if the Americans haven't done it, I would guess that probably nowhere else has done it, but maybe
no, Europeans have done it. The Dutch version, the Belgian version already had. I think every season have a gay couple. You guys took a few years into the series to do it. Americans, as I said, never did it. We're pioneering in that, semi-pioneering in that regard. Look, first of all, we have to say, not only because it's on my channel, had great ratings. The wedding itself had a peak of, I think it was the most watched wedding scene of all of the seasons of Married at First Sight. Chatunami Mabat Rishon in Hebrew. The reason I wanted to discuss this with you is because this is such an interesting paradox in Israel, in the country in which the rabbinate kind of controls weddings and funerals, and still parts of the communities like the ultra-Orthodox communities and specifically the Arab communities are not very open to this. But on the other hand, Israel is this sort of, you don't have to sell Tel Aviv as being one of the LGBTQ most friendly cities in the world. The Supreme Court with its legislation moving Israel forward. So it's a mixed bag, but it's a very interesting story. And by the way, no uproar in Israel at all. I think that the creators of this series were a bit trepidatious before, but now they just saw that it actually went down quite easily.
So this is hard for people outside, I think, to understand. And it reminds me a little of our conversation a few weeks back about abortion rights, where Israel simultaneously is, look, on one level, a theocracy. The rabbinate do have power over things which are civil in other countries, marriage and divorce and the like. And yet, in that case, had a much looser, more liberal abortion policy in practice, you explained, than obviously the United States in that comparison. Here, again, I'm really interested to know how we explain those two things. That on the one hand, the rabbis have a big, prominent role. Traditional, strict Orthodox Judaism takes a dim view of
it's in the Bible. I think it's in the Bible.
It's, homosexuality not permitted under, the sacred texts. And yet, as you say, this went by without an eyebrow raised. How do we explain that? To what to me looks like a disconnect.
Well, I'm not sure it's a disconnect. I think the trajectory in general is of inclusivity. I mean, on the one hand, again, as we said, the Supreme Court is very forward-thinking in LGBTQ rights. Recently, in a landmark decision, lift surrogacy restrictions for the gay community. No issues in Israel about being openly gay in the military or in parliament in any way. You will never see a "don't say gay" law in this country. And you even have, Jonathan, this is very interesting, more and more openly religious gay Israelis, which I think a decade or more ago would seem like either you leave religion or you live a lie. And this is becoming something very, very interesting. I think specifically Yair Ettinger, who's a very talented journalist, is writing about this in his book that will come out in English about the religious Zionist community and, among other things, their relationship to this. Now, on the other hand, we need to say this, right? As we say, the chief rabbinate does control weddings. There aren't civil marriages in this country for gay couples or for heterosexual couples. You have incidences. You did have two major incidents of violence against the gay community. Shira Banki, a teenager, was murdered in 2015 in the Pride Parade in Jerusalem. You had a shooting in a gay community center in Tel Aviv in 2009. There are these stories. But still, I think the general trajectory, because of the courts, because of the general population, is moving more and more forward to this issue in the Knesset. You see the ultra-Orthodox members of Knesset talking against it. It always seems to me that the louder you talk, the more you know you're losing. I think that in that regard, that is what is happening to this society.
To be clear, though, same-sex marriages don't happen inside Israel in the same way that civil marriages don't happen.
Right. But under law, it is recognized. So you have tax issues, inheritance issues, the issue if you have a partner that has a child, you can adopt them. This does happen. Again, a lot of the Supreme Court decisions around this, but you don't have same-sex marriages in this country. Again, as you say, like you don't have the civil marriages.
So a same-sex couple who want to be married in Israel would have to go abroad to Cyprus or wherever.
Yes, they can't officiate their relationship, but they will have to go. They would have to go abroad.
Yeah, but they can have the rights as if they were a married couple under Israeli law because of those decisions. So I think it was interesting your point about religious. And that's obvious, we should say that's because the marriages are done by the rabbinate, they're religious marriages. And so since the religious community would not marry two people of the same sex, therefore there are no same-sex marriages inside Israel.
Right, but in the same way they wouldn't have issues with someone who, from the aspect of the halacha, will not be Jewish, marrying with Jew, even if they're a heterosexual couple, you will have a issue with the rabbinate. So there are a lot of issues happening there that aren't specifically connected to the LGBTQ community.
Yeah. So the shift, if it may come, would have to come within religion. And so that's why what you say about you see more Orthodox gay people or people who are openly gay and Orthodox is really fascinating, because from the perspective of Jewish communities outside, of course, progressive communities have been, open and inclusive for a long time, Reform and liberal Jewish communities. In the world of the Orthodox and ultra-Orthodox, I think this is one of those issues that is coming. And my guess is that Israel will be further down this track. Absolutely, it would probably still be the case that if you wanted to live an overtly, strictly Orthodox life and be openly gay, you'd have to choose. Mm-hmm. It would be one or the other. I think that would probably still be the case. But there are, you feel there are the very beginnings of change there. Yeah. I see it, in the next generation, where the idea that is a choice is sort of rejected. And, I know people in my own generation where I think there was quite a well-known case of somebody who was gay and Orthodox and came out, and then immediately it was sort of did then move into a Reform congregation, as if that was obvious. You'd have to do that. Mm. And I now see in the next generation Orthodox Jewish gay people challenging that and saying, no, I don't have to say one or the other. I want to be both.
Right.
That's one to watch, and whether Israel leads that or follows that is going to be really interesting. But yeah, I think that's an anomaly right there that we've talked about, which is on the one hand, socially, liberally, culturally, it's at the point where you can have a same-sex couple getting maximum ratings for being married on TV, and then at the same time, legally, they can't marry. So how did you get around that?
By the way, no one on the show gets married legally. We should say that. I think in the American show they do, officially get married, but in this,
so how do they get married on the Israeli show?
It's not really married. It's married for television, to be honest, because there's not a rabbi officiating it. It's more a rabbi type looking person. And you do have the glass, like the breaking of the glass and a Jewish wedding and the chuppah. So it's kind of a made for television. Nobody really gets married, because then they have to go through the rabbinate and then they have to go get a divorce if they separate. So it's made for television.
It may surprise you to hear that actually I have more sympathy for that approach than I did for my 40 minutes watching Married at First Sight Australia, because I am so old-fashioned. I discovered that's what I didn't like about it. I didn't like the fact that it debased real marriage. I'm now sounding like someone from the 15th or 16th century. I know, but I thought marriage is quite special, and you don't just do it on TV for the first person you've met.
No, I think I convinced you to actually watch the Israeli version of it.
The Israeli version I can make my peace with. It's the other ones that I've got a problem with. So yet again, I feel we're making great progress here today. We're resolving a lot of issues. I think so.
So world peace, what's next? What's next on our agenda?
You forget the coalition that's unraveling. They should just put us two in charge. I feel that, we've achieved a lot is how I would want to put it. We should probably round off this sterling achievement with some awards.
Yes, and you go first, I think. No? I've been talking too much.
There was a lot of competition for our Mensch Award this week. I did want to give an honourable mention to Yariv Moser, movie director, Israeli documentary maker. He has unearthed tapes of Adolf Eichmann, architect of the Nazi final solution. essentially confessing to his role in the murder of 6 million Jews, which sharply contradicts what Eichmann said on the stand in his trial in Israel in 1961. These tapes are hugely revealing. They're going to be heard in this new documentary. And so a mensch award to the director, Yariv Moser, for finding those. But I think we go back in some ways to our opening story, which is this horrific shooting in Texas that left 19 school children and 2 of their teachers. One of the statements, and there have been many that came out, was from Steve Kerr, who is an NBA basketball coach, who just really let it all out with this plea that went viral, urging politicians to do something, just do something to deal with the gun problem.
In the last 10 days, we've had elderly black people killed in a supermarket in Buffalo. We've had Asian churchgoers killed in Southern California. And now we have children murdered at school. When are we going to do something? I'm tired. I'm so tired of getting up here and offering condolences to the devastated families that are out there. I'm tired of the moments of silence. Enough. We can't get numb to this. We are being held hostage by 50 senators in Washington who refuse to even put it to a vote. They won't vote on it because they want to hold on to their own power. It's pathetic. I've had enough.
And it had extra weight partly because, football coaches and basketball coaches, sports coaches are huge authority figures, as you know, in the United States. People really do listen to them. But he also, Steve Kerr, came at this with great sort of personal knowledge, because in 1984, when he was just 18 years old, his own father was assassinated by Islamic Jihad because his father was the president of the American University of Beirut, and his father, Malcolm Kerr, was a big expert on the Arab world. So Steve Kerr lost his father to gun violence. His father was shot twice in the head outside his office when he was just 52 years old. So when Steve Kerr talks about this, even besides his place in sporting culture and national life, he comes at this with great sort of emotional and moral authority. And the speech, it's worth finding if you haven't heard it. It's just, very powerful, went viral, and deserved to have done, and it deserved to have got people's attention.
Yeah, and just to think about, I think we made that point when we talked about gun violence, right? That there's a difference between an external threat and terrorism and an enemy coming from within. And it's a different thing to deal with. Shall I lighten our mood a little bit with our chutzpah award?
Do. Yes, please.
It's a friendly chutzpah award, right? It's not a nasty chutzpah award. But we mentioned this show before on our podcast, The Marvelous Mrs. Maisel. I think I watched it more than you did, Jonathan, but that's fine. And
did I? Because I gave up, I think, after the first season. Did you do more than that?
A little bit.
Yeah. Okay.
So it's to any of our listeners who haven't seen it. Midge Maisel is a housewife turned stand-up comedian in the 60s. It's funny, and it's a sweet show, and it's of course very, very Jewish. And now a story came out that they are filming an Israeli scene looking for, quote, Jewish types. Now, first of all, they are filming a scene in a kibbutz, which will be Long Island, which I have some things to say about that. But they're looking again for Jewish types. I just hope that they're going to do the scene where they run into the 19-year-old Bernie Sanders on a kibbutz. That I think could be very cool. But we mentioned this whole story when we discussed the issue of Jew face and casting non-Jews in Jewish roles. By the way, Rachel Brosnahan, who's the lead, and I think a very good lead in this series, is not Jewish, which has been mentioned a few times in this discussion. So I think the fact that they are looking for Jewish types is interesting in itself.
Yeah, I'd love to see them define Jewish types. They would have trouble with that, I think. Did we want to give a little shout out?
Creator of the show, by the way, I think is also Jewish. Amy Sherman Palladino also created the wonderful Gilmore Girls. So just saying.
Yeah. I mean, I like Rachel Brosnahan in it as well. Although I couldn't help but think this wouldn't have been a hard role to cast with a Jewish actor.
I don't know how to tell you this. I did not think of her not being Jewish at all until you mentioned it on the podcast.
Really?
Yes.
Oh, really?
She's a great actress. She does this great role. I don't know. I was never bothered by the fact.
But it screamed non-Jew to me. But did we want to give a little affectionate mention to Davos and the World Economic Forum, do you think?
What, the fact that everyone flew in their private jets and wrote that they're dealing with climate change? Yes, I think.
Yeah, I just loved the wording. I loved the wording. I think it was a tweet, and they just said, "Super excited," or excited that as the delegates to our Davos gathering fly in, we're about to talk about climate change. And it's just, you thought, just don't say fly in. Just say arrive. Then no one will give you a hard time. But Davos delegates are flying in, as you say, often on private jets. And we're super excited to be talking about the oncoming climate crisis, the ongoing.
They didn't say they were going to solve
crisis.
it. They just said they were going to talk about it. I don't see the problem.
Yeah, no, if they wanted to solve it, they would have left it to you and me on an edition of Unholy, because we are just barreling through
the Jewish
world's
problem
problems.
solvers. I think we should change our Tudor history, and problem solving is our expertise. I think that's nice.
Yeah,
it really is.
That's good. Bear in mind, probably by the time people hear it, Tudor history will be quite literally history. We will be on to something else. It could be Othello. It could be The Great Gatsby.
Oh, wow. We have stuff to talk. Great Gatsby we can do. Okay, we have stuff to talk about, my friend.
So Unholy can set up itself as an
tangentially connected
clinic.
To our main topic. We will say our thank yous to Rom Atik and Gaia Glaser and Omer Primat and Irad Escher for original music.
We will. And of course, if you've enjoyed our solving of the world's problems, you must rate us, follow us, spread the love. We are very grateful when you do that.
And we'll meet next week, Jonathan.
See you then, Yonit.
See you.